The wood guy pulled up to my driveway in Palmer, Alaska, and I couldn't help but grin at the sight of 3 cords of perfectly seasoned birch and spruce stacked high on his flatbed. Winter was coming fast, and I had learned the hard way during my first year in this frozen wilderness that you could never have too much firewood when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. My name is Oliver Irving, and I had moved to this neighborhood called Frontier Ridge Estates about 2 years ago, looking for peace and quiet after spending most of my life in Chicago. The irony of moving to Alaska to escape stress was not lost on me, but at least here the cold was honest. It did not pretend to be your friend while stabbing you in the back like the corporate world had done for 15 years. The delivery guy, a weathered man named Tom who looked like he had been splitting wood since before I was born, helped me stack the logs along the side of my house. We arranged them neatly in 3 rows, each about 6 feet high and 8 feet long. The wood was beautiful, really, all cut to uniform lengths and dried to perfection. In Alaska, good firewood was not just a luxury, it was survival. "That should keep you warm through the winter," Tom said, accepting his payment. "Maybe into spring too, depending on how cold it gets." "I hope so," I replied, already imagining the warmth radiating from my wood stove on those brutal January nights. Last year I ran out in March and had to pay premium prices for green wood that barely burned. Tom nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, you always want to stock up in summer. Smart thinking." After he left, I spent another hour organizing the wood, making sure it was covered with tarps to keep off any snow. My property was about half an acre, and I had plenty of room for the wood along the side yard, away from the main view but easily accessible from my back door. The whole setup was practical, efficient, and exactly what I needed. I should have known that practicality and efficiency were about to become my worst enemies. 3 days later, I was working from home, typing away at my computer when my doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock and saw it was exactly 2 in the afternoon. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a woman who looked like she had been born to complain about things. She was maybe 50, with perfectly styled blonde hair that looked shellacked into place, and she wore a cream-colored pantsuit despite the fact that it was September in Alaska, and most people were already breaking out their winter gear. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite my annoyance at being interrupted. "I certainly hope so," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "My name is Patricia Morrison, and I am the president of the Frontier Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Are you Oliver Irving?" "That's me," I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I had dealt with an HOA once before in a townhouse I had rented in Illinois, and it had been one of the most frustrating experiences of my life. When I bought this house, the realtor had mentioned there was an HOA, but she had assured me it was very laid back and mainly existed to maintain the main road and organize the occasional neighborhood gathering. Apparently, she had lied. "I am here to discuss a violation of our community standards," Patricia said, pulling out an iPad and tapping at the screen. "It has come to our attention that you have an excessive amount of firewood stored on your property, which violates Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our HOA bylaws regarding outdoor storage." I stared at her. "Excuse me, the firewood," she repeated, as if speaking to a child. "You have far too much of it visible from the street, and it creates an unsightly appearance that degrades the aesthetic value of our community." "You can barely see it from the street," I protested. "It's on the side of my house, and I made sure to keep it neat and covered. This is Alaska. Everyone needs firewood." Patricia's smile did not reach her eyes. Our bylaws state that outdoor storage must be limited to reasonable amounts and must not be visible from public areas. Your current storage exceeds both of those requirements. I have taken photographs for our records." She turned her iPad around to show me pictures she had clearly walked onto my property to take. The photos showed my woodpile from multiple angles, some taken from positions that would have required her to go pretty far into my yard. "Did you just walk around my property taking pictures without my permission?" I asked, my voice rising. "As HOA president, I have the authority to conduct inspections to ensure compliance with our community standards," she said primly. "Now, you have 30 days to reduce your firewood storage to a reasonable amount, which we define as no more than half a cord visible from any angle. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $50 until the violation is corrected." I felt my face getting hot. Half a cord. That would not last me through December. Do you have any idea how much wood it takes to heat a house through an Alaskan winter? "That is not the concern of the HOA," Patricia said. "Our concern is maintaining property values and ensuring that all residents adhere to the same standards. If you need additional firewood, you can store it inside your garage. My garage is full of my workshop equipment. I am a woodworker. I need that space." "Then I suggest you find another solution," she said, handing me a printed copy of the violation notice. 30 days, Mr. Irving. The clock starts today." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on my driveway with an aggressive staccato that matched her personality perfectly. I stood there holding the notice, reading through the ridiculous bylaws that apparently governed my life now. Section 7, Paragraph 3 was indeed about outdoor storage, but it was written in such vague language that it could be interpreted to mean almost anything. The phrase "reasonable amounts" was not defined anywhere, and neither was "excessive." Over the next few days, I tried to find a compromise. I rearranged the wood, moved some behind my shed where it was even less visible, and even built a simple wooden frame around part of the pile to make it look more intentional and neat. I took photos of everything and emailed them to Patricia, explaining that I had made efforts to address her concerns while still maintaining enough wood to heat my home. Her response was brief and cold. "Your modifications are insufficient. The violation remains in effect." 25 days remaining. I started asking around the neighborhood, and I discovered that I was not the only person Patricia had targeted. My neighbor, a retired veteran named Mike, told me she had fined him $300 for having his trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though he had just forgotten to bring them in after the truck came. Another neighbor, a young couple with 2 kids, had been cited for having toys in their front yard, but I also learned something more interesting. Patricia had only lived in the neighborhood for about 8 months. She had moved in, immediately run for HOA president in an election that only 12 people out of 70 households had voted in, and had won by a margin of 7-5. Since taking office, she had apparently made it her personal mission to enforce every obscure rule in the HOA handbook, plus a few she seemed to be making up as she went along. Why does not anyone stop her? I asked Mike while we stood in his driveway, watching the sunset paint the Chugach Mountains gold and pink. "Most people just pay the fines and move on," he said with a shrug. "It's easier than fighting. Plus, the HOA bylaws give the president a lot of power. You would have to get enough people together to vote her out, and good luck organizing that. Everyone's too busy just trying to live their lives." I went home that night and read through the entire HOA handbook, all 47 pages of it. It was a nightmare of bureaucratic language and contradictory rules, clearly written by someone who had never actually lived in Alaska. There were rules about lawn maintenance that made no sense in a climate where grass only grew for about 4 months out of the year. There were rules about exterior paint colors that required approval from the HOA board, which consisted of Patricia and 2 other people who apparently just rubber-stamped whatever she wanted. But buried in Section 12, I found something interesting. Any HOA decision could be appealed to the full board, and if the board's decision was still unsatisfactory, it could be taken to a vote of all homeowners. A simple majority would be sufficient to override the board. I started preparing my appeal. 20 days after receiving the initial notice, I submitted a formal written appeal to the HOA board, citing the unreasonable nature of the firewood restriction given Alaska's climate and the vague language of the bylaws. I included testimonials from 3 other neighbors who confirmed that my woodpile was not an eyesore and did not negatively impact property values. I even got a statement from Tom, the wood delivery guy, explaining that 3 cords was actually a conservative amount for heating a home through an Alaskan winter. The board meeting was held at Patricia's house, which should have been my first clue about how it would go. The other 2 board members were a nervous-looking man named Keith and a woman named Sandra, who seemed more interested in her phone than anything else. I presented my case calmly and logically, explaining that the rule as written was impossible to comply with while still maintaining a safe and warm home during winter. Patricia listened to my entire presentation with a smile that suggested she was merely tolerating me. When I finished, she did not even pause before responding. "Your appeal is denied," she said. "The rules are clear, and they apply to everyone equally. 10 days remain for you to comply with the violation notice." "But you did not even discuss it with the other board members," I protested. "We discussed it before you arrived," Patricia said. "Our decision is unanimous. If you wish to challenge this further, you can petition for a full neighborhood vote, but that requires signatures from 30% of the homeowners, and the vote can only be held at our annual meeting in March." March was 6 months away. Winter would be long over by then, and I would have already frozen or paid thousands in fines. I looked at Keith and Sandra. "Do you 2 even live in houses that use wood heat?" Keith looked uncomfortable. "I have natural gas." Sandra did not look up from her phone. "Same. So you are making rules about something you do not even understand," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Neither of you has any idea what it takes to heat with wood." "That's irrelevant," Patricia interjected. "The rules exist to maintain community standards, not to cater to individual circumstances. This meeting is over, Mr. Irving." I left that meeting furious but also more determined than ever. If they wanted to play hardball, I could play hardball too. I spent the next week going door to door, talking to every single homeowner in Frontier Ridge Estates. Out of 70 households, I managed to have actual conversations with representatives from 43 of them. What I discovered was enlightening. Most people were quietly frustrated with Patricia's aggressive enforcement tactics, but they felt powerless to do anything about it. Several people had considered selling their homes just to escape the HOA drama. But when I explained that we could force a vote to either remove Patricia or amend the bylaws, people started to get interested. The problem was time. Even if I got the 30% signatures, we could not hold an official vote until March. Meanwhile, my deadline was approaching fast, and Patricia had made it clear that she would start issuing daily fines the moment I was in violation. Then I had an idea. It was petty. It was probably going to cause me some problems, but it would definitely make a point. On day 29, 1 day before the deadline, I put an ad on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and several local Alaska forums. "Firewood for sale. Premium seasoned birch and spruce, 3 cords, will sell individually or in bulk. Delivery available. Must sell immediately. I priced it reasonably, but not cheaply. Within hours, my phone was blowing up with calls and messages. Everyone in Alaska was always looking for good firewood, especially heading into October when the weather could turn nasty at any moment. I started scheduling pickups, and over the next 3 days, I sold every single piece of wood I had bought. The process was bittersweet. Each person who came to haul away my carefully stacked wood was taking away my preparation, my security against the coming winter. But watching the pile shrink also gave me a grim satisfaction. Patricia wanted me to get rid of it, and I was complying in the most literal way possible. On the morning of day 32, after the last of the wood had been sold, Patricia showed up at my door with her iPad and her self-satisfied smile. She looked at the empty space where the woodpile had been, and her smile grew wider. "I am pleased to see you have finally complied with the HOA regulations," she said. "Consider this matter resolved." "Oh, it's resolved," I said. "I sold every bit of it, all 3 cords gone." Something flickered in her expression. "You sold it. Why would you do that?" "Where will you get your firewood for the winter?" "That's not the concern of the HOA," I replied, echoing her earlier words back to her. "Your concern is maintaining property values and ensuring that all residents adhere to the same standards. Well, I am in compliance now." "But you will need wood to heat your home," she said, and for the first time she sounded uncertain. "Actually, I have been looking into alternatives," I said. This was true. Over the past week, in between selling wood and gathering signatures for my petition, I had been researching other options. "Did you know that there are several houses in this neighborhood that rely entirely or partially on wood heat?" "That's not unusual in Alaska," Patricia said. "Right. In fact, according to the neighborhood plans filed with the county, about 35% of the homes in Frontier Ridge estates use wood as either a primary or supplementary heat source." "Want to know why?" She did not answer, but I continued anyway. "Because when this subdivision was developed 8 years ago, the developer wanted to keep costs down. So instead of running natural gas lines to every house, they only ran them to about half the neighborhood. The houses on my side of the main road, we do not have natural gas access. Our options are wood, oil, or electric heat. Oil is expensive as hell, and electric heat in Alaska is financially ruinous, so most of us use wood." I could see her processing this information, trying to find a way it could be wrong. "The HOA bylaws do not make exceptions for heating needs," she finally said. "You are right, they do not. Which is why I have been talking to the other 38 households on this side of the neighborhood. Turns out, most of them heat with wood too. And they are all very interested to learn that according to the HOA bylaws as you interpret them, they are all in violation and subject to the same fines you threatened me with." Patricia's face went pale. "That is not what I meant. Your pile was excessive. According to what standard?" "You said half a cord was the maximum. That would not get any of us through winter. So either your interpretation is wrong, or you are about to fine 40% of the neighborhood." "I will need to review this with the board," she said stiffly. "You do that. In the meantime, I will continue gathering signatures for my petition. Once I have 30%, we can have a special meeting to discuss revising these bylaws to actually make sense for Alaska. I am already at 28%, by the way. Should hit 30% by end of business today." She left without another word, and I watched her walk back to her car with a satisfaction that was probably unhealthy but felt absolutely justified. The next few weeks were interesting. Patricia sent out an email to the entire neighborhood clarifying that the firewood storage rule only applied to excessive and unsightly accumulations, and that reasonable amounts for heating purposes were acceptable. She did not define what reasonable meant, but she also did not issue any more firewood-related violations. I hit my 30% signature threshold and officially petitioned for a special meeting. According to the bylaws, the HOA had to schedule it within 60 days. They scheduled it for the maximum allowable time, of course, which would put us in mid-December. Meanwhile, winter was coming and I had no firewood. I could have just bought more wood. That would have been the logical solution. But I was angry, and anger sometimes makes you commit to stupid courses of action just to make a point. So instead of buying firewood, I bought a high-efficiency oil furnace. This was not a small purchase. A good oil furnace with installation cost me about $8,000. But I had the money saved, and more importantly, I had a plan. If Patricia wanted to force me to change my heating setup, I would change it in a way that would highlight exactly how unreasonable her rules were. The furnace installation took 3 days, and I made sure to be home the entire time, watching the workers and learning everything I could about the system. It was actually pretty impressive technology, much more efficient than the old wood stove had been. The technician explained that it would cost me roughly $400 to $500 per month to heat my house through the winter, depending on oil prices and how cold it got. That was about 3 times what it cost me to heat with wood, but I could afford it for one winter. What I did not expect was for Patricia to find a new problem. The oil tank had to be installed outside, next to my house. It was a standard 275-gallon tank, ugly but functional, painted white to help it blend in with snow. The installation company placed it in the least visible spot possible, on the side of my house opposite from the street, exactly where my woodpile had been. 2 days after installation, I got another notice from Patricia. Outdoor fuel storage tanks must be screened from view per Section 7, Paragraph 5. Please install appropriate screening within 30 days or face daily fines of $50. I actually laughed when I read it. The woman was relentless. I had to give her that. But this time, I did not comply. Instead, I took photos of the tank and its location, documented that it was in the least visible spot possible, and filed my own complaint with the HOA board about harassment. I also forwarded everything to the lawyer I had started consulting with about the increasingly absurd situation. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Jennifer Adams who specialized in property law, reviewed everything and made an interesting discovery. The HOA bylaws had been written in 2017, but they had never been properly filed with the state. In Alaska, HOA governing documents have to be recorded with the state to be fully enforceable. Ours had not been. This did not mean the HOA had no power, but it did mean their power was significantly more limited than they had been acting like it was. More importantly, it meant that their fine structure was not legally enforceable through courts. They could fine me all they wanted, but if I refused to pay, their only recourse would be to place a lien on my property, and even that would be challengeable given the improper filing. Jennifer advised me to stop engaging with Patricia entirely and to wait for the special meeting in December. In the meantime, she sent a formal letter to the HOA board informing them of the filing issue and advising that any fines issued would be contested. Patricia did not take this well. I started getting multiple notices per week. My grass was too long, even though it was November and everything was covered in snow. My house numbers were not clearly visible, even though they were literally the same as every other house on the street. My mailbox was not regulation size, even though it had been installed by the previous owner and had never been an issue before. Each notice came with threats of fines, and each one I forwarded to Jennifer, who was building quite the case for harassment. Other neighbors started experiencing the same thing. Keith, who had voted with Patricia at my appeal hearing, found himself cited for having holiday decorations up too early. Sandra got a violation for parking her car on the street overnight when her garage was full of moving boxes. The more Patricia lashed out, the more people turned against her. By the time December rolled around and the special meeting was scheduled, I had signatures from 52% of the homeowners, way more than the required 30%. The meeting was scheduled for December 15th at the community center, a small building at the entrance to our neighborhood that was usually used for neighborhood barbecues and the occasional birthday party. The meeting was scheduled to start at 7 in the evening, but people started arriving at 6:30. By the time I got there at 6:45, the parking lot was nearly full. I had never seen this many neighbors in one place before. The community center, which could probably hold about 80 people comfortably, was packed with at least 60 residents, all bundled up against the cold and buzzing with conversation. Patricia stood at the front of the room next to a folding table with Keith and Sandra. She looked composed, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She had to know this was not going to go her way. At exactly 7, she called the meeting to order by tapping a gavel on the table. The room gradually quieted. "Thank you all for coming," Patricia said, her voice projecting across the room. "We are here tonight because a petition was filed by Oliver Irving calling for a vote on proposed changes to our HOA bylaws and on the composition of the board. Per our governing documents, we will hear the proposal, have a period of discussion, and then conduct a vote. Mr. Irving, you have the floor." I stood up from my seat near the front and turned to address the crowd. I had spent the last week preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, I felt surprisingly calm. "Thanks everyone for coming out tonight," I started. "I know it's cold and you probably have better things to do, so I will try to keep this brief. When I moved to this neighborhood 2 years ago, I thought I was moving to a community where neighbors helped each other and where common sense prevailed. But over the past few months, I have watched our HOA become less about maintaining our community and more about enforcing arbitrary rules that do not make sense for where we live." I pulled out my copies of the violation notices. I was fined for having firewood on my property. Firewood that I needed to heat my home through winter. When I sold all my wood to comply with the HOA demands, I had to spend $8,000 on a new heating system that costs me 3 times as much to run. Then, I was fined for the fuel tank that system requires. Other neighbors have been fined for trash cans, for holiday decorations, for toys in their yards. I saw heads nodding around the room. The problem is not that we need rules. Rules make sense. The problem is that our current rules were written without consideration for Alaska, and they are being enforced without common sense or flexibility. So tonight, I am proposing 2 things. First, that we vote to amend our bylaws to specifically allow reasonable outdoor storage necessary for heating, including firewood and fuel tanks, as long as they are maintained safely and neatly. Second, that we hold an immediate election for HOA board positions so that everyone who wants to serve has a chance to do so. Patricia stood up. "That is not how this works. Board elections are only held during our annual meeting in March." Jennifer, who had come with me, stood up from her seat in the back. "Actually, Mrs. Morrison, the bylaws allow for special elections if requested by petition with 30% of homeowners. Mr. Irving has 52%. The election is valid. Patricia's face reddened. Who are you? Jennifer Adams, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Irving in this matter. This is a neighborhood meeting, not a courtroom, Patricia snapped. You are correct, Jennifer said smoothly, but it's still a legal proceeding governed by your bylaws and state law. Would you like me to continue explaining the law, or would you prefer to proceed with the meeting as requested? Patricia sat down hard, and I noticed Keith and Sandra had both moved slightly away from her. The discussion period was lively. Multiple people stood up to share their own experiences with what they felt were unreasonable HOA actions. Mike talked about his trash can fine. A woman named Rachel described being cited because her kid's treehouse was visible from the street. Another man named George explained that he had received a violation for storing his fishing boat next to his garage during the summer, even though lots of Alaskans kept boats on their property. But there were also a few people who defended Patricia. One older couple argued that rules were necessary to keep the neighborhood from looking run down. A middle-aged man said that without strict enforcement, property values would drop. The arguments went back and forth for about 45 minutes until Jennifer finally stood and suggested we move to a vote. Patricia, looking defeated, agreed. We voted on the amendment first. By show of hands, it passed with about 70% in favor. The rule change was official. Reasonable outdoor storage for heating and essential purposes was now explicitly allowed, with reasonable defined as amounts typical for Alaska residential use and maintained in good condition. Then came the board election. Patricia announced that she was running for re-election as president and that Keith and Sandra were running for their positions again. Then the floor was opened for other nominations. To my surprise, Mike nominated me for president. Rachel seconded it. When Patricia asked if I accepted the nomination, I hesitated. I had not really thought about actually being HOA president. I just wanted to fix the rules. But looking around the room at all the faces of people who had been dealing with the same frustrations I had, I realized someone needed to do it. I accept, I said. 2 other people were nominated for the other board positions. We voted by secret ballot this time, using slips of paper that Jennifer had wisely brought along. Sandra and Keith helped count, and when the results were announced, I had won the presidency with 43 votes to Patricia's 17. Patricia stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out without a word. Keith and Sandra both stayed long enough to congratulate the new board before leaving as well. After the official business was done, people hung around for another hour, talking and laughing like we had all just won something together. In a way, we had. We had taken back our neighborhood from someone who had been using it to feed her own need for control. I drove home that night feeling tired but satisfied, watching the northern lights dance green and purple across the sky. The next morning, I called Tom, the wood guy, and ordered 5 cords of firewood. I thought you switched to oil, he said, sounding confused. I did, but I am switching back, I told him. The oil furnace works, but nothing beats wood heat when it is 40 below. Plus, I can actually afford it now that I am not paying HOA fines. He laughed and promised delivery in 3 days. As the new HOA president, my first official act was to send an email to all residents explaining the new rules and assuring everyone that enforcement would be reasonable and fair. My second act was to schedule a board meeting to review all outstanding violations and dismiss any that were based on the old interpretations. We dismissed 17 violations, including all of Patricia's recent citations against me and others. Winter settled in hard that year. By January, We had several weeks where the temperature did not get above -20 degrees. My new oil furnace ran constantly, and I was grateful for the backup heat it provided. But I was even more grateful for the woodpile stacked neatly next to my house, covered in tarps and ready to feed my wood stove on the coldest nights. I saw Patricia a few times over the winter, usually driving past my house or at the grocery store. She never acknowledged me, which was fine. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was considering moving, that she had never really adjusted to Alaska anyway, and had only moved here because her husband got transferred for work. In March, she put her house up for sale. By April, she was gone. The following year, our neighborhood had one of the highest attendance rates at HOA meetings in the region. We used our dues to actually improve the community, fixing potholes in the main road, upgrading the entrance sign, and organizing quarterly social events that people actually wanted to attend. We amended more bylaws to make them Alaska appropriate, including rules about vehicle storage that acknowledged that many people needed to keep trucks or snowmobiles accessible, and rules about lawn maintenance that recognized we only had a short growing season. I served as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down and letting someone else take over. The experience had taught me something important about communities. They only work when everyone feels heard and when rules serve the people rather than the other way around. My woodpile never became an issue again. In fact, in my second winter after the Patricia situation, 3 neighbors asked me where I bought my wood because they liked how neat and well-organized my stack looked. I gave them Tom's number, and he ended up delivering to half the neighborhood. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled across the Chugach Mountains and the temperature dropped so low that the snow squeaked under your boots, I would load up my wood stove and watch the flames dance behind the glass door. The heat would radiate through my house, warm and reliable, and earned through standing up for what made sense. I thought about that day. Patricia showed up at my door with her iPad and her rules, and how close I had come to just accepting her interpretation and spending every winter cold or broke or both. I thought about all the neighbors who had quietly paid fines they should not have had to pay, just because fighting seemed too hard. Sometimes standing up to unreasonable authority costs you something. For me, it cost $8,000 for a furnace I did not really need, countless hours organizing a petition and preparing for meetings, and the stress of months of conflict with someone who saw herself as the defender of standards, but who really just wanted control. But it also gave me something valuable. A community that actually felt like a community, neighbors who knew they could question things that did not make sense, and the satisfaction of knowing that the next person who moved to Frontier Ridge Estates would not have to fight the same ridiculous battles. Mike became one of my closest friends. We split wood together sometimes, trading labor for the satisfaction of preparing for winter the way Alaskans had for generations. Rachel and her husband invited me to dinner regularly. George and I went fishing on the Kenai River in the summers. These relationships probably would have formed eventually anyway, but they were strengthened by our shared experience of taking back our neighborhood from someone who did not understand it. Years later, I still live in the same house. My woodpile still stands proudly next to my house every winter, sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller depending on how much I think I will need. The oil furnace is still there too, serving as backup heat and as a reminder of what I went through to defend something as simple as the right to stay warm. New people have moved into Patricia's old house, a young family from Anchorage with 3 kids who were excited to move to a place with more space. Within a week of moving in, the dad came over to ask where he could buy firewood. I gave him Tom's number and helped him stack his first delivery, 3 cords of beautiful seasoned spruce. "Is the HOA okay with this?" he asked nervously, eyeing the growing pile. I grinned. "The HOA requires it to be stored safely and kept neat. As long as you do that, you are fine." Welcome to the neighborhood. The relief on his face was familiar. It was the relief of someone who had been worried they would have to fight just to live their life normally, and who had just learned they did not have to. That night, after helping my new neighbor get settled, I sat on my back deck with a beer and watched the sun set behind the mountains. It was September again, almost exactly 4 years since this whole thing had started. The air was getting crisp, and I could smell wood smoke from someone's chimney down the street. In a few weeks, I would order my wood for the coming winter. The cycle continued, reliable and predictable. My phone buzzed with an email from the current HOA president, asking if I would be willing to review some proposed updates to the bylaws. I smiled and typed out a quick reply agreeing to look them over. Even though I was not on the board anymore, people still valued my input, mostly because everyone remembered what happened when we let the wrong person have too much unchecked power. The stars were coming out now, brilliant in the clear Alaska sky. Inside my house, I knew the wood stove was ready for its first fire of the season. Tomorrow I would clean out the ash from last spring and make sure everything was ready for winter. But tonight, I just sat and enjoyed the peace of living in a place where common sense had won, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where a man could stack his firewood without fear of arbitrary punishment from someone who valued appearances over survival. That was worth every hour of fighting, every dollar spent, and every moment of frustration along the way. Patricia had tried to find me into submission, to force me to follow rules that made no sense, to make me choose between comfort and compliance. Instead, I had sold every bit of my wood, proven my point, and changed the system so no one else would have to make that choice. As I headed inside for the night, I ran my hand along the neat stack of logs waiting by the door, leftover from last winter. They were dry and solid, ready to burn when needed. Just like the community we had built, strong, reliable, and ready to provide warmth when the cold came calling. And in Alaska, the cold always comes calling eventually. But now we were ready for it together, without someone standing over us with a rule book that made no sense telling us we were doing survival wrong. I loaded a few logs into the stove and lit the kindling, watching as the flames caught and grew. The warmth spread quickly, filling the room with that particular comfort that only comes from wood heat. It was not just warmth. It was independence, preparation, and the knowledge that I had fought for the right to live this way and won. Outside, the temperature was already dropping below freezing. By morning, there would be frost on the windows and ice on the puddles. By November, we would be in deep winter. And when January came with its brutal cold and short days, I would be warm and comfortable, surrounded by 3 cords of wood that no one could tell me was excessive or unreasonable or against any rule. Because sometimes the best revenge is not just proving someone wrong. It is changing things so thoroughly that their wrongness becomes obvious to everyone, permanently and undeniably. Patricia had tried to control something she did not understand, and in doing so, she had awakened a community that had been too complacent to question authority. The fire crackled and popped, and I settled into my chair with my book, content in the knowledge that this winter, and every winter after, I would be warm on my own terms. The HOA still existed, still maintained our road and organized events, still had rules that made sense for our community. But it served us now, instead of the other way around, and that made all the difference in the world.